In the dim undercurrents of a city that thrived on secrets, Mara Ellis had always chased truths for a living, her words sharp as scalpels in the broadcast booth. But tonight, as the weight of her fractured past pressed against the fragile bonds of her present, she faced a recording that demanded more than facts. It called for the raw unraveling of trust she thought she'd buried. The studio lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the cluttered editing bay. The studio lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the cluttered editing bay. Mara Ellis sat poised at the anchor desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a sleek mediator device, a compact recorder meant to capture unfiltered truths. But today, it felt like a relic, its glass screen faintly cracked from some unseen drop during setup. She glanced at it, the fracture spiderwebbing like a vein under skin, and felt the old tightness coil in her chest. "All right, Mara, let's roll on the opener," the producer, Elena, called from behind the console. Her voice was brisk, efficient, the kind that sliced through hesitation. Isaiah lingered in the shadowed corner, arms crossed, his journalist's notebook idle in his lap. He watched without a word, his gaze a quiet pressure, supportive yet distant, as if measuring the space between them. Mara nodded, adjusting her posture, but the words stuck. The script on the teleprompter blurred. In a world where trust fractures like glass, she was supposed to launch the episode, frame the investigation into betrayal's long shadow, interviews with those who turned away from intimacy, their stories, raw footage, waiting in the queue. But her mind snagged on the past, those heavy boots of memory trudging through her thoughts, scuffing the polish she'd applied for the camera. Tessa's face flickered unbidden, the childhood friend who'd shattered everything with a single lie years ago. How could she speak of trust when her own voice trembled at the edges? "Take your time," Elena said, but there was an edge to it, the clock ticking toward airtime. Mara cleared her throat, leaning into the microphone. "Tonight, we delve into the ruins of broken bonds. What happens when deception lingers, reshaping how we connect, or refuse to?" Her delivery was steady, almost clinical, but inside, the walls she'd built felt paper thin. The cracked mediator caught the light as she gestured toward it, a prop for the theme. Yet it mocked her. Transparency demanded. But her pain? That stayed locked away. They cut to the rough cuts. A woman in her 40s, eyes hollow, recounting a partner's infidelity that left her barricaded behind routines. "I stopped believing," she said, voice flat. Another clip, a man staring at the sea, admitting he'd ghosted every chance at closeness. Mara watched, the footage pulling at her guarded core, stirring a cautious unease. Isaiah shifted slightly, his attention a tangible weight, but he stayed silent, letting her navigate alone. As the screen faded, Elena clapped. "Solid start. Resources are greenlit. More interviews tomorrow." Mara forced a smile, but the question hung unspoken in the dimming lights. Could she unravel trust's fragile web for the world without letting her own fractures show? The mediator's crack gleamed, unanswered, as preparations for the next segment unfolded the following day. The shooting set hummed under the coastal city's perpetual haze. Neon-tinted lights flickering like hesitant confessions against the warehouse walls. Mara adjusted the microphone clipped to her collar, her fingers lingering a beat too long on the cool metal, a small anchor against the tide rising in her chest. Isaiah stood just off camera, his notebook half open in his lap, eyes steady but distant. The space between them a quiet gulf she both craved and feared. Aaron emerged from the shadows of the prop table, his frame lean and unassuming, the kind of actor who blended into roles until they clung to him. He nodded at the director, then at Mara, his smile polite but edged with recognition. Mara Ellis, been a while. His voice carried the low timbre of old acquaintances, the ones forged in the wreckage of shared histories. She forced a professional nod, confusion knotting her gut like an unsolved riddle. Aaron had known her ex, intimately, back when trust was a word she'd thrown around like loose change. Now here he was, cast as the witness in Isaiah's documentary segment on relational fractures, his lines scripted to probe the very betrayals that still echoed in her sleep. "Let's keep it focused," she said, her tone clipped, aiming for the interview's theme, rebuilding after deception. But the words tasted like ash. How could she discuss trust with the man who'd once laughed in the kitchen of her shattered life? They settled into the scene, cameras rolling with a soft whir. Aaron leaned forward, script in hand, his eyes locking onto hers. "In your experience, can memory ever let go? Or does it just reroute everything?" The question hung, mirroring the one she couldn't voice. "Why you, of all people?" Mara's throat tightened, fear coiling twice over, first at the proximity of old wounds, second at the vulnerability it dragged to the surface. She glanced at the prop table, where a faded antique map lay unfurled, its intricate patterns of ancient trade routes snaking like veins across weathered paper. Paths that twisted, intersected, never quite erased. One line veered sharply, a betrayal of direction, and she wondered if her own history mapped the same. Old roads dictating every step, no matter how she tried to chart anew. "I think memory doesn't let go," she managed, voice straining against the pull. "It just influences the path." Confusion swirled, her pulse a staccato under the lights, but as Aaron listened, nodding with a quiet intensity that felt earned, not performative, something shifted. Tense respect flickered in, unbidden, softening the edges of her guard. He wasn't mocking. He was reflecting, his own lines laced with a subtle weight that suggested he'd walked similar fractures. Isaiah shifted in his chair, his gaze a silent tether across the room. Support without intrusion, a reminder that distance could bridge rather than divide. Yet as the take wrapped, Mara exhaled, the map's patterns lingering in her mind. Could she navigate this dialogue without the past snapping back, rerouting her words into silence? The question lingered, unanswered, as the set lights dimmed to twilight blue. Later that evening, as the investigation deepened, the dim glow of the studio lamps cast long shadows across the interview set. A cramped corner of the urban broadcast loft, where the ocean's distant murmur seeped through the walls like an uninvited whisper. Isaiah adjusted his notes behind the camera rig, his voice steady as he leaned forward. "Ms. Harlan, take us back to the beginning. That lie you told as a child. How did it echo into your marriages?" The witness, Elena Harlan, perched on the edge of her stool, her fingers twisting a frayed tissue. She was in her 40s, lines etched around eyes that darted like trapped birds. "It was nothing, really. Just a story to my little brother about our parents coming back from a trip they never took. I was 8, shielding him from the divorce papers. But he believed me, and when the truth hit," her voice cracked, pausing as if tasting the words, "he stopped trusting anyone. And me, every relationship since, I wait for the fracture. I lie to preempt it, or I freeze when they ask too much." Mara sat in the shadows, off camera, arms crossed like a barrier against the chill air. She had come to observe, to support Isaiah's probe into relational deceptions, but now Elena's words landed like pebbles in still water, rippling through her own guarded core. The woman's tale wasn't hers, yet the echo was unmistakable, a child's fabrication to protect, blooming into adult suspicion. Mara's breath caught, her chest tightening as if the room's air had thickened. She felt the pull, that old betrayal from Tessa surfacing unbidden, the one she'd buried under routines with Isaiah. Closed off, she told herself it was just a story, unrelated, but her pulse betrayed her, a subtle tremor in her hands. On the lectern between interviewer and witness sat a small, unassuming mirror, part of the setup for reflective testimony. Isaiah had explained earlier, to capture unguarded glances. Now, as Elena spoke, the light from the overhead fixture caught its edge, fracturing into a soft gleam that danced across Mara's knee. She stared at it, the tiny surface holding fragments of the room. Isaiah's focused profile, Elena's hunched form, and her own blurred reflection, eyes wide with something unnamed. The mirror didn't lie, it just reflected the cracks. Isaiah glanced her way, his journalist's eye catching the faint shake in her shoulders. He didn't interrupt, didn't probe, just nodded subtly, his presence a quiet anchor in the tense air. Elena continued, linking her childhood deceit to a broader pattern in the city's underreported betrayals, cases Isaiah was weaving into his documentary. It starts small, she said, but the distrust, it spreads like salt in the tide, eroding everything. Mara's throat tightened, her inner voice weakening under the weight. For the first time, she listened, not just to Elena, but to the stirrings within, fluctuations of self-doubt, hints of honesty, peering through the veil. Could this stranger's unraveling spark her own? The question hung, unanswered, as the ocean outside swelled against the night. In the quiet hours that followed, back at their shared space, the camera's lens hummed softly in the dimly lit living room, capturing the urban glow filtering through rain-streaked windows. Mara sat on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid, fingers tracing the seam of a worn notebook, the one filled with unsent letters. Isaiah adjusted the microphone stand across from her, his movements deliberate, eyes flicking to her face with that measured distance he wielded like a shield. They were midway through another interview segment for his documentary on deception's long shadow, the kind that probed too close to their own fractures. A faint, static crackle interrupted the quiet. From the tangle of cables on the coffee table, an old cassette player, forgotten relic from Isaiah's research pile, whirred to life, unbidden. Perhaps a loose wire, or the remote's accidental nudge. The tape inside, warped and damaged, began to spool unevenly, its magnetic ribbon frayed at the edges, like a scar refusing to fade. Mara's breath caught. The voice that emerged was Tessa's, younger, sharper, laced with the casual cruelty of old confidences. "I didn't mean for it to hurt like this, Mara. But you were always so intense. I told him everything, okay? Your secrets, the ones you swore me to. It was just easier that way." The words tangled in the hiss of distortion, the damaged tape skipping, repeating fragments. Your secrets, easier that way. The room shrank. Mara's chest tightened, a familiar lock clicking shut. She leaned back, crossing her arms, gaze dropping to the floorboards, where shadows pooled like unspoken accusations. The betrayal flooded back, not the event itself, but its echo, the way it had hollowed her out years ago, leaving her to rebuild walls with logic alone. Fear coiled in her gut, alive again, whispering that trust was a fool's gamble. She glanced at Isaiah, his face half lit by the camera's red eye, but said nothing. Distance was safer. It kept the fracture from spreading. Isaiah paused the tape with a gentle click, the damaged ribbon halting mid-unfurl, glistening faintly under the lamp like exposed nerves. He watched her, silent, his journalist's detachment a deliberate space, giving her room to orbit the memory without pulling her in. No questions, no probes, just the weight of observation. Mara's hands trembled slightly on her knees, the closed shell of her body cracking just enough. The voice lingered in the air, a ghost demanding audience. Could she listen, truly hear it, without retreating further into the void between them? The camera rolled on, capturing the unspoken tide. With the echoes of that unintended playback still reverberating, the investigation pressed onward into the next broadcast day, where the studio lights hummed low, casting elongated shadows across the interview set. Mara adjusted her microphone, her fingers steady on the cracked mediator glass that separated her from Hale, a wiry man in his 40s, his eyes darting like minnows in shallow water. Isaiah sat just off camera, his notebook open but untouched, a silent anchor in the dim periphery. She felt nothing at first, a professional numbness shielding her from the broadcast's weight. This was just another voice in the investigation, another thread in the unraveling tapestry of deceit. "Tell us about the first time," Mara prompted, her voice even, detached. The glass between them fractured the light, splintering Hale's reflection into jagged pieces. Hale leaned forward, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "I was 22, betrayed by my own brother, stole my identity, my future, left me with nothing but rage." His words spilled out measured, rehearsed, but then he paused, fishing in his coat pocket. He pulled out a worn passport, its edges frayed like old wounds, pages yellowed and stamped with visas from cities he'd fled. This was mine once, but I used it to become someone else. Lied to lovers, to friends, even to myself. Deception became my armor after that first break." Mara's gaze fixed on the passport, its creases mapping a life of evasion. Indifference cracked. A flicker of recognition stirred in her chest. Here was no simple victim, but a mirror, his lies echoing the fracture Tessa had left in her youth, the one that still shadowed her nights with Isaiah. She wanted to accuse, to demand why he'd perpetuated the cycle, yet the mediator's role pinned her. Listen, probe, reflect. Internal tension coiled tighter, her pulse quickening as Hale continued. "It started as protection," he said, voice dropping, "but it poisoned everything. I see it now. The guilt eats deeper than the original hurt." His eyes met hers through the glass, pleading, human. Empathy crept in, unbidden, anxious and unwelcome, blurring the line between his story and her own buried ache. Was this what Isaiah watched for? Her walls thinning under the weight of shared shadows? She nodded, throat tight, the question unspoken. Could she truly hear him, this man whose deceptions replayed her pain without the fracture widening? The broadcast rolled on, but in that suspended moment, the possibility lingered. A bridge forged in the ambiguity of wounds. Seeking deeper insight amid the mounting personal reflections, Mara turned to professional guidance in the therapy room, which hummed with the low whir of a digital projector, casting a web of glowing lines across the wall. A neural network model, synapses firing in simulated bursts of blue light. "Doctor." Nandor leaned forward in his armchair, his voice steady as a metronome, fingers tracing the air as if rewiring the invisible paths between them. "See here, Mara," he said, pointing to a cluster of nodes pulsing on the screen. These trajectories, your brain's ancient wiring, betrayal carves them deep, amygdala lights up, cortisol floods, and suddenly, every shadow is a threat. It's not weakness, it's survival, your guardedness. That's the neurons doing their job, building walls to keep the pain out. Mara sat rigid on the couch, arms crossed like a barrier, her eyes fixed on the model. Isaiah lingered in the corner chair, silent, his notebook unopened on his lap, watching, always watching, as if documenting her unraveling for some unseen broadcast. Justified distrust coiled in her chest, a familiar anchor. Why argue? The science confirmed what she felt. Trust was a glitch, a risk her mind wouldn't compute. But why bother rewiring? She countered, her voice edged with the precision of someone who'd scripted this rebuttal 100 times. If my brain's screaming, danger, every time Isaiah looks away too long, what's the point? Logic says, stay safe. Move on. These walls aren't optional. They're me. Nandor tilted his head, the model's light etching faint lines on his face. Ah, but that's the elegant lie, isn't it? Neurons explain the protection. They don't dictate the choice. Memory maps the minefield, Mara. But you hold the map. Insist on data alone, and you're just reinforcing the old paths. Feel the pull. Logic versus that knot in your gut. What if the fear isn't a sentence, but a signal to choose differently? She shifted, glancing at Isaiah. His eyes met hers, not probing, but present, a quiet admission in the way he leaned in. For the first time, she felt it, the fear, not as armor, but as a live wire inside, humming with possibility. The model's nodes flickered, a chaotic bloom, mirroring the tense realization, dawning. Memory shaped her, but didn't own her. Yet the question lingered, unanswered in the air. Why trust again when the brain offered only walls? As the session's insights settled into the evening, a more personal confrontation arose in Mara's apartment, where the city hummed beyond the open window, neon veins pulsing against the twilight ocean. But inside, the air hung thick with unspoken currents. She sat cross-legged on the worn couch, a half-empty mug of chamomile cooling in her hands, while Erin perched on the edge of the armchair, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Night had deepened their conversation, from casual catch-up to this raw, uncharted territory. You keep circling it, Mara said, her voice edged with skepticism, eyes narrowing like she was dissecting a flawed interview clip. The past. Why drag it up now? We've both moved on, haven't we? She leaned back, arms crossed, the familiar wall rising. Trust felt like a cracked glass, beautiful from afar, but one wrong pressure and it shattered. Erin hesitated, her gaze dropping to the coffee table, cluttered with takeout wrappers, and that old journal, its leather cover frayed from years of neglect. It had been a relic, stuffed in a drawer, letters unsent to ghosts like this one. Moved on? Mara, that's the lie we both tell. I brought something. She pulled a small envelope from her bag, faded photos, yellowed notes from their childhood summers, mementos she'd hoarded like evidence in a cold case. Not to accuse, just to remember what we lost. And why? Mara's skepticism cracked, a flicker of doubt softening her posture. She reached for the journal instinctively, flipping it open to blank pages, marred by faint ink stains. Words she'd scribbled and erased, emotions buried like tide-pulled secrets. Her fingers lingered on the spine, the weight of it pulling her back. I've avoided this for so long, she admitted, voice quieter now, threading toward tenderness. The words, saying them out loud. I thought if I didn't, It wouldn't hurt anymore. But listening, maybe I'm ready. Aaron's eyes met hers, a fragile bridge forming in the dim lamplight. It wasn't just me betraying you. It was us, running from the mess. Isaiah, he's waiting in the wings, you know. This could make room for him, for all of us. The envelope lay between them, unopened, a test of whether voicing the hidden would sever or mend. Mara traced the journal's edge, the ocean's murmur echoing her inner tide. Could she name the wound bare, without the armor of doubt? The question lingered, unanswered, as tenderness bloomed in the silence. The weight of that exchange carried into the studio the next morning, where the studio lights flickered like a faltering heartbeat, casting erratic shadows across the cluttered set. Mara stood frozen before the monitor, her fingers hovering over the console. The technical glitch had struck mid-reel. A cascade of static had nearly wiped the raw footage from the drive. Now, the clip looped unbidden, a close-up of her face during the trust exercise. Isaiah's hand extended, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I can't. Not yet." No edits, no filters. Just the uncensored tremor in her lips, the raw doubt spilling out like blood from an old wound. Producers clustered behind her, murmuring urgently. "Cut it," one insisted, his voice clipped. "The press will devour this. Too vulnerable, too real. We're not making a therapy session." The air hummed with their impatience, the coastal city's neon glow seeping through the warehouse windows, turning the room into a tide pool of hesitation. Mara felt it pull at her, erase the moment, sanitize the pain, keep the fracture hidden, or let it breathe, expose the shadow that had haunted her since Tessa's betrayal clawed its way back into her life. Her gaze drifted to the cracked glass mediator device on the table, the interview prop they'd used earlier, its fracture spider webbing, like a memory refusing to heal. It caught the monitor's glow, refracting her trembling reflection back at her, eyes wide, not with fear, but with the ghost of resolve. Isaiah stepped closer, his journalist's notebook tucked away for once. "Mara," he said softly, his hand brushing her arm, not probing, not observing, but anchoring. "This isn't evidence for my story. It's us. If you keep it, I'll stand with you. All of it." She swallowed, heart pounding against the weight of choice. The glitch had forced her hand, shoving the past into the frame. Censor it, and she'd bury the truth again. Let the lie of logical trust win. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Cut it? Soften the edges? Layer in ambient waves to drown the hurt? The safe edit, the one that kept her wound private, buried under professional gloss. Doubt coiled in her chest, tight as the cracked glass mediator device on the desk beside her. The one from their first interview, its fracture line a permanent scar. She could excise the audio, let the narrative flow without this personal intrusion, preserve the distance that had defined her for so long. Isaiah sat across the room, unmoving in the armchair, his notebook idle in his lap. He watched without a word, his silence a deliberate gift, eyes steady, but not pressing. No judgment, just presence. It unnerved her more than interference would have. Her gaze drifted to the old journal on the coffee table, its leather cover worn soft from years of unopened secrets, letters she'd never sent, words she'd scripted in solitude after Tessa's knife twist of friendship. She reached for it, flipping it open to a yellowed page. The ink faded, but the pain sharp. Trust is a tide that pulls you under if you don't name the undertow. Memory surged, not as saboteur, but as insistent wave, demanding she choose. Erase the sound, and what? Let the shadow linger unspoken, dictating every frame, every future connection. Or let it play, exposed, linking Isaiah's investigation to her fractured core, inviting viewers, and him, to witness the mending. The cursor blinked, accusatory. Her breath hitched, doubt fracturing into something firmer. A resolve, born of exhaustion with hiding. She hit play. The static crackled to life, her voice breaking through. And I carried it, Tessa, like a stone in my throat. No fade, no cutaway to neon-lit streets. The betrayal stood bare, intertwined with the episode's climax. A former victim's forgiveness interview, their words echoing hers. Isaiah shifted slightly, a nod of quiet faith, but she barely registered it. This was her edit, her voice, reclaiming the narrative. As the final frame locked in, the ocean's tide seemed to still outside the window. Mara leaned back, journal clutched in her lap. The weight of unsent letters lighter now. Would this rawness revive trust, or merely echo the fracture forever? The question lingered, unanswered, in the hum of the finished reel, culminating in a pivotal team meeting the following day. The conference room hummed with muted dissent, the kind that settled like fog over the coastal city's tangled streets. Mara stood at the head of the long oak table, her fingers tracing the edge of a tablet, displaying the raw footage. Hale's confession, unedited, his voice cracking like thin ice underfoot. The team leaned in, faces lit by the glow of screens, editors furrowing brows, producers tapping pens, and a handful of early audience proxies from the progressive podcasts that amplified Isaiah's investigations. "It's too vulnerable," one editor said, voice sharp as a winter gust. That pause where Hale deflects. "It's messy. Viewers will tune out, or worse, tear it apart. Edit it down, Mara, for the story's sake." Her pulse quickened, a familiar fear coiling in her chest, the old shadow of betrayal, whispering that exposure invited fracture. She glanced at Isaiah, seated midway down the table, his notebook open but untouched, eyes steady on her. Beside him, Erin from the production crew nodded in reluctant agreement, her role as buffer now testing thin. The public preview panel loomed tomorrow, and the pressure mounted. Delete the raw moment, smooth the edges, preserve the illusion of control. But Mara had chosen this path, hadn't she? Releasing the unprocessed truth, letting Hale's deflection stand as a mirror to her own hesitations. We can't," she began, her voice threading the air like a hesitant wave lapping at twilight shores. The words caught, fear tightening her throat. What if they saw her waver, this woman still piecing together trust from shards? The room's overhead lights felt clinical, exposing every doubt. But then her gaze caught the warm lamp on the side table, its amber glow spilling soft across forgotten coffee mugs, a quiet hearth amid the storm. It reminded her of evenings in her apartment, ocean murmurs outside, where she'd first opened that unsent journal to Isaiah. Not erasure, but light on the cracks. She straightened, breath steadying into resolve. This isn't just footage. It's the fracture line. Hale's pause, his shift from confession to armor, that's the betrayal alive, not buried. Editing it out sanitizes the pain, turns it into another safe explanation. We've built this series on uncovering shadows, linking my partner's probes to the real cost of silence. Her words gained footing, linking the investigation's threads to her own unraveling trust. Isaiah's nod was subtle, his protector stance easing into partnership, Erin mirroring with a faint smile. Respect blooming where defense had lingered. Murmurs rippled, questions firing. But the backlash, the shame in our community for raw weakness, Mara met them. unflinching now. Acknowledgement doesn't destroy, it clears space for trust to breathe. The warm lamp flickered as someone shifted, casting elongated shadows that danced but didn't swallow the light. Could she hold this line, defend the unhewn truth before an unforgiving audience? The choice hung, electric, as the room fell to contemplative hush.